morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Stutz, the director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. This morning, our gracious volunteer, Terri Meeks, will be talking about pension records. But before I turn it over to Terri, I just wanted to go over a few general housekeeping notes and some announcements. If you have any questions or comments you would like to share during the program, please type them in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout the program, and we will make sure all of your questions get addressed at the end of the presentation. If you'd like to test that feature now, please type hello so we know that you can hear us. As for announcements, we would like to invite all of you to join us next Saturday, June 17th, for another Junior Fossil Activity Day from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. This event is free and open to the public. We will have fun and engaging fossil-related activities for kids of all ages, as well as the Fossilmobile from Florissant. And of course, our fossil volunteers will be on hand putting the last finishing touches to our 2 recently found fossils. The following week, on Wednesday, June 21st, the museum will be hosting another community coffee and conversation at 9 a.m. at the museum with free coffee and donuts. This month's topic will be on camping in Fremont County. And in July, we are planning another historic bike tour of Lakeside Cemetery. You'll have to stay tuned in the coming weeks. We will be posting more details and how to register for the event on our Facebook page. And Terri's next virtual genealogy program will be on July 8th at 9 a.m. Terri will be discussing overcoming pitfalls in genealogy research. We will be posting our online registration for this program in the coming weeks as well. Again, thank you for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Terri.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. Today, we're going to talk about some of the information that might be hidden in the pension records. We look at the pension records and we see the military service of some of our ancestors, but have you read every single line of these pension records? There might be something that you have overlooked. So we're going to take a look at that this morning and see what might be revealed. One of the first things to consider is, what are the wars that we have actually participated in? We had first the colonial wars, starting in the 1600s and going up to the Revolutionary War. There was King Philip's Wars. Many of them were lumped together and called the French and Indian Wars. So we then have the Revolutionary War that we are all very familiar with, War of 1812, that actually lasted 3 years. The Mexican War, which is a little overlooked in many of our genealogical research queries. But it lasted for a couple of years, and a lot of militia units actually participated in that war. We're all very familiar with the Civil War, and for a long period of time, we had Indian wars that lasted for a couple of hundred years. Actually 100 years, I'm sorry. The Spanish-American War, which was a very small 90-day war, and the Philippine insurrection. In more modern times, we have the following wars that many of us have become familiar with. But when thinking about the pension records, we're going to specifically look at some of the earlier wars. Many of the pension records for World War I, World War II, and the succeeding wars are not available to the public. So we're just going to take a look at these early pension records. One of the first hurdles that we need to overcome is where to find these records. When talking about the colonial wars, many of those, it was before the United States military, either the Army or the Navy existed, so that they were manned by state militias. The Indian Wars, as well as the Mexican War, were also manned by state militias and National Guard units. And those pension records are maintained by state and local archives. It's also important to note that if you had a member of the Confederacy, that their military records from the Civil War are also located in state and local archives. Ancestry does have some actual pension records, but for the most part, it's only the indexes, and we will be seeing some of the index cards. Fold 3, which is another subscription website, is especially good for Revolutionary War pension records. And I encourage you, they are available either by subscription or by visiting a local family history center. And I do encourage you to try and look at these records. In many cases, they are multiple pages. We're talking about 17, 20, 30 pages of information and testimony. Fold 3 is also in the process of doing the 1812 pension records, and they have gotten pretty far in that. I think they're in about the 80% range on that. So look for those as well. All of the rest of the records are housed at the National Archives. And at the end of the presentation, I'll have a form that will show you how to actually request these. One of the things to take into consideration is that not everyone applied for a pension. And for the most part, the pension acts themselves that granted pensions came many years after the actual conflicts, so that the applications were indeed made many years later. I think it was the government's intention that they not have to pay out a whole bunch of money to these servicemen, so that they waited sometimes 20, 30, or even 40 years before enacting legislation that would allow members or their families to apply for their pensions. When finding these records, number one, they do exist for service between 1775 and 1916, which would be some of the early records for World War I. The applications themselves might include some discharge papers. In many, many cases, especially in the earlier wars, they need witnesses to attest to the fact that the person actually did serve for the amount of time that they were required. And you might also find narratives of service, what they actually did in performing their duties, what battles they might have been involved in. And we see sometimes physical descriptions of our ancestors. We can find birth, marriage, and death records. And in many cases, we also find pension actual payments. It's very interesting to realize that these men and their families were applying for pensions, but we consider the actual amount, a nominal amount that they actually received in their payment. And of course, we might find some enlistment and separation dates for their actual service. But some of the things that we are actually looking for are those birth, marriage, and death dates, especially in the Revolutionary War time frame and the 1812 time frame, when many of those ancestors didn't live long enough to survive to the 1850 census to be enumerated with their families. In some cases, we might find a wife's name, her maiden name, and perhaps you might even find an unknown wife. Did your ancestor have a first wife or a third wife? And your ancestor might, or you may be descended from the second wife. So there may be additional information in there that you did not know about. Children's names, and especially maybe the girls' married names, might appear in some of these records prior to the 1850 census. We've mentioned also the physical description of people. I've often wondered, do I look similar to someone from a previous generation? And what was their physical status? Were they blind? Were they deaf? Had they suffered an amputation? Did they have scars in any way? Before the introduction of dog tags, for example, it was very important for a complete physical description of the person to be recorded. It might have been the only way to identify them on the battlefield should they fall. And there might be correspondence. Did someone write a letter that was unable to be delivered? Was there correspondence between the veteran of the war and the government to assure a pension? So we're going to take a chronological look at some of the wars and the various forms of pension records that we're going to see for each of these, and see what we can uncover in those records. It's important to realize that the timing of the various pension acts that do affect each one of these wars. So, for example, in the Revolutionary War, as early as 1776, when the war was just initially beginning, there was a Pension Act law that was granted half pay for life for those who had been disabled in the war. Unfortunately, there was a fire in 1800 at the National Archives, and the records between 1776 and 1800 were destroyed. So the remaining pension records that NARA does hold don't begin until 1800. So our war started in 1776. So now we're looking 40 years later in 1818, when we finally get a pension for soldiers who are in financial need. We're still not talking about everybody. And in their applications, they had to actually prove that they were poverty-stricken. This Pension Act only applied to those who had served in the regular Continental Army or the Continental Navy. It did not include those who had provided service in the state regiments or in the militia. So here we're talking still about a small number of soldiers. It's not until 1832, almost 60 years later, that we are getting a pension based on service. And they could get full pay for life. Now, you have to understand in the Revolution that there might not have been much in that full pay. The government was barely getting started. And at this time, they issued bounty land warrants because they didn't have money to pay the Revolutionary War soldiers. So their pension with full pay is probably not going to be significant. They did issue half pay for those who had served more than 6 months, but less than 2 years. And it did finally include all Revolutionary War units. And it also allowed and introduced eligibility for their widows. Here is an example of a pension paper from a Dennis Smith. One of the first things I want to call out is that this is being requested as late as 1852. So this is many, many years after the war. And this application is actually from one of his children. We're going to take a closer look at each one of the documents that we examined today. This pension application is one of a series of, I think it was actually 27 pages of information. And multiple children filled out the application and repeated some of the same information, but there were also many other revelations in the file. So, to wit, that he is one of the children, this is a Christopher Smith, of Elizabeth. So we first get Elizabeth is the wife of Dennis Smith. We're looking at 1852, and she is already deceased. So you may not, if there's not a tombstone, you may not have known Elizabeth's name. We at least get a first name, if not a surname. And that they are deceased, and that the aforesaid father was a soldier in the Army of the Revolution for more than 2 years. So he's applying under that stipulation. And that his aforesaid father died in about 1829 or 1830, and left his aforesaid mother a widow, who remained a widow until her death, which took place on the 19th day of September, 1845. So we have a father's possible date, and we have a mother's actual date of death. In looking further through the file, we find a listing of the children. And in the case of the women, we get their married names. So we have Elizabeth married, or Elizabeth Smith is now Johns. Susan is a Barry. Peter Smith who has since died. Remember, this application was filed in 1852. Dennis Smith, the son, who has also since died. Polly Smith, Hannah Wiggins, who has since died. Catherine Seals, Christian Smith, this declarant. David Smith, Rachel Foster, and Abraham Smith. We have an entire listing of all of the children of this family. And with a common name like Smith, this is extremely valuable information. Another page, we see a whole bunch of dates. So let's look at those a little more closely. This is still Christian. He believes that his aforesaid father and mother were married in the year 1771 in the state of Pennsylvania. And we have the listing of the children again with their years of birth. And we have approximate years of birth, but in a couple of cases, we actually have actual dates of birth. Christian is the one who is supplying this, and we see that he is actually born on August 26th, 1790. And his younger sibling, 1792, with an actual date, and Abraham, the youngest, in March of 1799. So here again, some of these people may not have lived until 1850, and with a common name like Smith, they may have been lost to history. You might also find listings of widows and the pensions that they were paid. So for example, this top section, we see the names. We see Rebecca Warren, and she is the widow of Joseph, and he was a private during the Revolutionary War. The numbers here represent the half-yearly payment that they were to receive when the pension actually commenced and the years that the pension was actually paid. And we also, we also see when these people might have, the widows might have passed away. Likewise, we see further down where the pension was discontinued because of the widow's death. And in many cases, they too died before 1850. This particular register happens to come from the state of Massachusetts, but there are others available through Ancestry. This is a pension record for an Alexander Smith, and this is his declaration, and it talks about his actual wartime service. In the spring of the year 1776, he volunteered in the company of militia commanded by Captain Cobb in Taunton in the state of Massachusetts, and marched from thence to New York, where the British fleet lay in the harbor of that city. So he's marching from Taunton, Massachusetts to New York City in 1776. That's a distance of about 200 miles if they went directly along the coast. And the troops in which he belonged were under the immediate command of General Putnam. They were forced by the British troops and marched from thence to the White Plains, where a battle was fought, and then went to Croton's Bridge, where he was discharged and sent home after having served 5 months. The pension record goes on to say that he re-enlisted in May or June of 1777 and had further service. I was particularly interested, this is not one of my relatives, but I was particularly interested in this record because White Plains and Croton are very near where I actually grew up. And his memory being much impaired by age and infirmity, he cannot recall at the present time that when he was actually discharged and by whom he was discharged, but he solemnly swears that he faithfully served for 3 years in the Continental Army. So he's trying to get that full pension rather than a half pension or no pension at all for not enough months. The War of 1812. Okay, the war was from 1812 to about 1815. And we're looking at the first Pension Act in 1871. So surviving soldiers and sailors were granted pensions. And fortunately, they only had to have served for 60 days. But an honorable discharge was required. And now, 6 years later, so we're talking 60 years after the fact. They say that if you have served for 14 days or in any engagement, you were entitled to a pension. And in this particular case, surviving widows also qualified for the pension. And the ignoring marriage date means that if the couple married after 1715, after the war, the widow was still eligible for her husband's pension. So we see a typed application under the file of Andrew Kern, and it is his wife, Margaret, who is applying. And this is under the Act of March 30th, 1866 for the War of 1812. So he is long gone. And at this point, she's just stating what his actual service was. She is Margaret Kern, the widow of Andrew Kern, and he enlisted in Philadelphia in September of 1814, and he acted as a quartermaster under Captain Correll and commanded by Colonel Sutherland, and that he got out 3 months later in December of 1814. This is one of those cases where a witness filled out paperwork. We have a Mary Robeson, and she's essentially echoing the same information, that she knows Margaret Kern, the widow of Andrew Kern, what his service dates were. And she is attesting to the fact that she knew this to be true information. We don't know Mary's relationship to Margaret. Is she simply a neighbor, or is she actually kinfolk, either on Andrew's side or on Margaret's side? Further investigation is required. And we see the actual first application on the 11th of April of 1866. Margaret is putting forth a request for this pension. And in the body, we see that she declares that she was married to Andrew in Philadelphia in July of 1828. And we get her maiden name. She was Margaret Irwin. And we get his death date. He died on the 11th of May in 1860. Whoops. My mouse doesn't seem to be working. There. Oh, we went backwards. Don't forget the War of 1812. This was the first time that the Navy played a significant role in combat. So for the first time, we are seeing a lot of naval records as well. And this is a cover sheet for Mr. John Marsden, Jr. And it says that he's a midshipman aboard the ship Congress, and what his service dates are, and his actual pension or his certificate. And in the text, we actually get a witness account of some of the action that he faced. And it says, he was attached to the Congress, the ship, and while on duty on board that ship, one of the sentinels on post at the cabin door made a thrust at him with a cutlass, which cut him very severely under the left arm. So it's not only enemies that you have to be worried about. And not being satisfied, although Midshipman Marsden drew off from the sentinel, he followed the said Marsden and made in another severe cut in the left shoulder. So he was definitely wounded by one of his own men and therefore eligible for his pension. The Mexican War. Here again, many of these were, the soldiers involved were either militia or National Guard units. And these records are in state and local archives. So there is a pension index available for these, especially on Family Search. And they do have, Family Search also has compiled service records from these 5 states for these people. The compiled service records don't give as much family history information, but more the actual military information. when they enlisted, what unit they were in, and when they might have been discharged. But Family Search does have the actual pension applications for those men that served in the Mormon Battalion. All others of these pension records for those that might have been in the regular Army are still at the National Archives. It's also important, especially with the Mexican War, and if you have been unable to find some of the records from the other wars that you think your ancestors might have participated in, there is something called the Old War Index. And it's important to look there as well, because sometimes the records are filed in with this set of pension records. So don't overlook this in terms of at least the index to see if perhaps a lost relative might have served in one of these conflicts. This index is available online, and it really refers to pensions that were based on death or disability. And they do cover all of the regular as well as the volunteer soldiers. So let's take a look at one of these. This is for Amos Cox, and he is part of the Mormon Battalion. These are some of the few records that are actually online at Family Search. He participated in the Mexican War from July 16th of 1846. And we'll take a look at what one of his witnesses is telling us, that he stopped at Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he was in good health. And I next saw him about September 1st, 1847, when he was complaining with a wound received in his thigh from a ball, a wild ball. So a bullet that had gone astray somehow had wounded him in the thigh. And there's a very elaborate description of the actual wound, the tuberosity, and that the wound, it's extending inward and upward 3.5 inches and 1/4 to 1/2 inches in width. And it's tender. It evidently extends to the bone. So this man was indeed suffering, and he had limited mobility in his thigh. So he definitely qualified for a disability pension. Here's one of those old war invalid cover sheets for a Myron Tanner, and it gives his years of service. And we'll blow this up. This is his invalid pension application. And it tells us that he's 57 years old. He's 5 feet 10 inches tall, with brown hair, brown eyes, and a dark complexion. And that on August 1st of 1846 or 47, he contracted scurvy, mumps, dysentery, and intermittent fever, which brought on kidney and lung diseases. So he too is applying for his pension. He was born on June 7th of 1826, and he is currently 60 years old. And he is granted the allowance. But look at this. His declaration was filed in May of 1887, and it took almost a year for him to actually qualify for the pension. And he's going to get $8 per month for that. So this is from a Civil War pension file, and this happens to be someone from my own family. And he is actually in the regular Army. He was a first lieutenant in the 9th Cavalry. And at this point, this letter is one of 2 pages where he is applying for campaign medals. He was applying for 2 separate campaign medals. So he is providing information about his military service in order to qualify for those. But in doing that, he says that he was born in the parish of Marew, county of Tipperary, Ireland. I was raised in Limerick. We get his immigration, landed in New York on the 3rd day of September, 1856. I resided there 4 months. Actually, in December of 1856, he applied to join the cavalry and was sent to Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania. And he goes on in the following 2 pages to explain his military service. I participated in the expedition against the Cheyenne Indians in 1857, conducted by Colonel E.B. Sumner. And he goes on to talk more about the engagement. So this covers the Indian Wars and his service there. Also in this file, apparently during the Civil War, his mother had not heard from him. So she is requesting information on her son, Michael Cooney, who is a captain in the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry. And we get his mother's name and an address. So this is probably, his mother was Anne Ryan Cooney, and Mrs. Ryan is probably his grandmother. And we get an actual address in Limerick, Ireland. Unfortunately, this address is now a large apartment building. We actually tried to visit. We see many of these index cards for our relatives. And this one is kind of surprising. Did you lose a member of your family when trying to track down stuff? Did they adopt an alias? So we see here that Walter Collins has served in the Civil War under the name of John Jones. And we see that he has a wife or a daughter, Cora Jones. And we see that he actually served in 2 completely different units. So it behooves you to write for the pension records for both sets of pension records from the National Archives. We see that he did get an invalid pension. He applied for it, was assigned an application date, and actually did receive a pension based on that while living in Texas. And then we have an application for a minor in 1909, but we do not get any confirmation that a pension was paid to that minor. But when we do get the files, we actually find a marriage license from Oklahoma in the year 1904. And we notice that John is now 66 and that Cora Robinson is 26, significantly older. We get their places of birth and where they are currently living. So here we've got a name change and we have a marriage for that name change. Here is another one that we see from the Civil War. And this gentleman, Daniel Gunnan, is served in the 7th New York Heavy Artillery. And we'll take a closer look. And in May or June of 1864, he was reported wounded at Cold Harbor on actually June 3rd, 1864. On the muster rolls out of the Company A, 7th New York Heavy Artillery, he is reported discharged on August 1st, 1865 with his company. In 1893, we see in the pension files, we actually get his certificate of death. And it turns out that he was actually killed in an accident. And I've subsequently found a newspaper article that explained the fracture of the skull and actually the broken neck. He was driving a wagon that carried wood logs. One of the wheels dislodged, the logs all fell off, knocked him off the wagon, and actually killed him instantly. So we also get the widow's pension application now. And from that, we see that his widow, she was married under the name Mary Flanagan to Daniel Gunnan on the 8th of June, 1888, and who married her and where. And that this was the legal marriage and such, but both had been previously married, but the marriage tie in each case had been dissolved by death. So Flanagan is Mary's first husband's name. And I did not know at this point that Daniel had been married previously. He has 2 children, John and Michael, that are minors at the time of his death. And we go on to get a witness statement that says that these people were well acquainted with the late Daniel Gunnan and also with his wife, the late Catherine Walsh, and who married them at St. Mary's Church in Troy on March 23rd, 1873. So we get the previous wife's name and their actual date of marriage. In terms of Southern records, we also need to consider Confederate pensions. If you look on Ancestry, in many cases, the links forward you to the Family Search website, and they do give listings for these states. Many of these records are still held in each of the states in their archives. But every now and then you come up against a record that you can find. This one happens to be for a William Carpenter, who is a native of Missouri, but he's applying for a pension in Louisiana. And it's a 2-page questionnaire, and it gives his birth in about 1842, where in Missouri he was born, when he enlisted in 1861, and he actually enlisted in Kansas. So we have him moving around quite a bit. This is the second page of the questionnaire that goes on to talk about his actual family. And we'll take that closer look. He was wounded in both legs, below the knees, by missiles from an unexploded shell, from which I still suffer. And he is married, and he has his second wife, and his current wife, he and the wife have 2 children. And he has other children from his first marriage. My wife is 28. He has, let's see, it's a son and daughters. And by his current wife, she's 28 years old, and he has 1 child, 2 years old, and 1 that is 4 years old. So he did have a previous wife, and he has 3 other children. We come to the more current, almost the 20th century, Spanish-American War. And we get fully typewritten compensation applications. This one happens to be from the state of Pennsylvania. The application, but the man is actually living in California. So let's see what we can derive here. We get his name, where his legal residence when he entered the service, and where he is currently residing. So here again, with a name like Jones, did you know that he had moved cross country and was now in California? It's very easy to lose someone who has a common name and moves such a great distance. That he enlisted and was commissioned, and it gives his date of service. And we notice that he has 2 completely different dates of service. We see that he's served in the Spanish-American War, but that he was also in the Navy from May of 1918 to June of 1922. His application was from Pennsylvania. He lives in California, but he was born in Kansas in 1879. So he has moved all over. And his dependent, we have Blanche Jones as his dependent. So we also see that his mother's name was Rose, and we get her maiden name, Mitchell. Unfortunately, his father is deceased, so we don't get his name. But again, we get his 2 different service dates and what his occupation was when he served in the Navy. And he got malaria in the Spanish War, so that's why he's applying for a pension. another gentleman, and he is also applying from Pennsylvania. And what I found interesting on this was that his name is Ezra Jacobs, but he's an Indian. So he's a Native American from Warren, Pennsylvania, and his current address is in Harrisville or Butler, Pennsylvania, where he was born, who his wife is, who his minor children are. Here again, his mother and her maiden name, and his father and his name. And we get where he actually served. And he was either on the staff or in the band of this infantry regiment. And he served from 1899 to 1901. So we have seen this morning quite a number of things that have popped out at us, where you have family members with uncommon names, and that have moved around a great deal. Those with aliases, we get women's names, their maiden names, or their married names. So there are many things that are hidden in the pension records. I particularly like to get those physical details, and it's always interesting to read exactly what they did in the war. We get unit histories, but we don't get the firsthand accounts that witnesses or the person provides themselves in a wartime environment. The pension records, as opposed to the military service records, will give you some of this genealogical information. And I do encourage you to write to the National Archives to get these records. Many of them are not online, so you do need to do the research and write for those. And make sure to read all of the pages. In many cases, we glance over some of the introduction information, and we see these pre-printed forms, and we scan them and think, okay, we've seen all of the information. But take the time to really read them, because sometimes there are hidden facts. At the beginning, I mentioned the National Archives. There is the website eservices.archives.gov, and it will tell you the forms, and it will actually have links for these forms that you need to complete in order to send. And you can get these records online, and you can request them digitally, as well as paper copies. And it gives you an idea of what the cost of each one of these records is going to be. I know the National Archives website will also tell you what the delay is, because of the pandemic of the last couple of years. Their services have been greatly backed up. So you may have to wait a considerable amount of time to get this information, but it is very valuable and worthwhile. So with that, I'll see that there aren't any questions this morning. But in case you want to ask a question, and next month, we're going to talk about pitfalls, the kinds of information or circumstances that you can fall into that just kind of overwhelm you. Have you found conflicting information, and how do you balance that? And what other records are there that you can find to resolve that? Is there some information that you've found that is actually patently wrong? And are you perhaps buried in paperwork and need some organization? So we'll look at identifying some of the pitfalls and how perhaps you can overcome some of those. With that, I thank you for joining us this morning and look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.